Albert Kite was always punctual, so when he didn't show up for work on Monday, May 24th, 2004, his colleagues knew something was definitely wrong. That afternoon, police arrived at his quiet Aurora, Colorado townhouse to perform a welfare check and discovered a basement of horrors beyond human comprehension. The 53-year-old lay deceased, face down on the floor, and all evidence indicated he had been subjected to unimaginable acts for hours. This was the start of a chilling, unsolved mystery that haunts Aurora to this day. Al had been a hard-working man with a comfortable life. He was known for his kind, helpful nature among friends and co-workers. By 2004, the 53-year-old was looking forward to a new chapter. He had recently begun a promising relationship with a woman named Linda, and he was searching for a new roommate to rent his basement apartment. Nothing in his life foreshadowed the terror that was about to be unleashed. He soon found an eager applicant for the vacant room. On May 19, 2004, a man calling himself Robert Cooper responded to Al's newspaper ad, claiming he had just moved from the East Coast for a job with Wells Fargo. The man met Al in person, paid a security deposit and half a month's rent up front, and received a house key. It all seemed like a routine rental arrangement. During one visit, Al's girlfriend Linda was at the house, but the prospective renter slipped away before Linda could get a good look at him. She did notice he appeared middle-aged with dark hair and walked with a limp using a cane. Still, everything about Robert Cooper seemed normal enough, and Al was glad to have a new tenant lined up. He had no idea that he was letting one of the most depraved predators possible into his home. Unbeknownst to Al, Robert Cooper had approached several other landlords in the area that same week, each time presenting a slightly different persona. One landlord recalled a man of a similar age with no limp and an Eastern European accent. Another remembered an older man who walked with a cane and spoke without an accent. Neighbors of Al later reported similarly strange encounters with the new tenant. One neighbor's greeting was ignored entirely, and another saw the man on a walking trail moving without any limp at all. It was as if he were a chameleon, altering his age, accent, and behavior to deflect suspicion. Saturday, May 22, 2004, began normally for Al. That morning, he drove Linda to the airport for a week-long trip. After seeing her off, he spent the day doing household chores. Around 3:30 p.m., when Linda's flight landed, she called Al and found him in good spirits. He said he had just finished fixing a leaky pipe in his basement with a neighbor's help. They wished each other a nice weekend, anticipating that they would be reunited soon. Tragically, that brief phone call was the last time anyone is known to have spoken to Al. Sometime over the next 2 days, the man calling himself Robert Cooper returned to Al's home to carry out his cruel plan. On Monday morning, May 24th, Al's absence at work set off alarms. Concerned co-workers contacted his sister, and Aurora police were dispatched to check on him. Officers arrived to find no answer at the door. After entering the house, they discovered Al's lifeless body on the basement floor. I don't generally get into the gruesome details for cases like this, but let's just say the level of violence visited upon Al might make a medieval inquisitor nauseous. The perpetrator had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. Several of Al's own kitchen knives, a glass, and even the key that this so-called Robert Cooper had been given were found soaking in a bleach-filled sink, as if to destroy fingerprints and DNA. The house had been wiped down with bleach, and bleach had been dumped down all the drains in an effort to wash away any trace evidence. Before fleeing, the perpetrator stole Al's wallet, cell phone, and pickup truck. Early on Sunday, the suspect was caught on an ATM camera wearing a ski mask and gloves, withdrawing about $1,000 using Al's debit card. He then abandoned Al's truck a few blocks away and discarded the stolen cell phone in a payphone booth. In a final act of caution, the perpetrator even took out Al's trash, presumably just in case any trace elements of his existence from the previous visits were found within. With the crime scene secured, detectives focused on the mysterious renter as the prime suspect. Tracking him down, however, proved nearly impossible. The rental application Robert Cooper had filled out was completely fraudulent. The name was an alias. The listed address was a building at a local campus, not a residence. The social security number belonged to an elderly woman in another state, and the reference phone number was for a retirement home. Everything was bogus information, and unfortunately Al, being a trusting and honest guy, clearly just went with his gut feeling. Investigators also discovered that the phone Cooper used to contact Al was a prepaid burner phone bought 2 months earlier and activated about 30 days after purchase. By waiting a month to activate it, the suspect ensured the store's surveillance footage of the phone purchase had been deleted, leaving police no video of him buying it. This level of pre-planning astonished detectives. At every turn, the perpetrator had anticipated how to obscure his trail. Despite the perpetrator's precautions, police did obtain a sample of his DNA from that drop of blood on the stairs. Frustratingly, when they ran the profile through national databases, it matched no known offender. The case had turned into a baffling whodunit, a shape-shifting suspect who vanished without a trace, leaving only an alias and an unknown DNA profile behind. Piecing together witness accounts gave investigators a hazy picture of who Robert Cooper was, at least in terms of physical appearance. Notably, the descriptions of the man were quite generic, for lack of a better term. By most descriptions, he was a white male of average height with a medium build and medium brown to dark brown hair. Witnesses placed him somewhere between his late 30s and 50s, and noted that his appearance and behavior could change. Some recalled a slight Eastern European accent, and that he walked with a limp aided by a cane, while others remembered no accent and no limp at all. Clearly, the suspect was adept at deception, altering his persona to avoid leaving any consistent impression. Investigators even consulted experts for insights, and the knots used to bind Al were so precise that one expert theorized the perpetrator might have had military or nautical training. Notably, the perpetrator also conducted a form of foot whipping, which is popular in the Old World, but almost entirely unknown in the States. This technique can leave someone with a permanent pronounced limp. Further, it's a technique which is still commonly used in Russian prisons. Combined with the Eastern European accent and the occasional limp, I have to speculate whether Robert Cooper may have experienced a similar technique used on him. Or perhaps, given the extreme lengths he took to cover his tracks, he knew how to feign the symptoms of undergoing foot whipping. Anyway, let's get back to the investigation for the moment, but I'll have more to say about my own personal theories on this disturbing case shortly. Perhaps unsurprisingly, detectives also struggled to identify anything approaching a motive in this case. The brutality suggested deep anger or a personal vendetta, yet they found no one in Al's life who had a reason to hurt him. While the perpetrator did take some money, the ferocity of the attack far exceeded a typical robbery. Investigators came to believe that the true motive was the thrill of the act itself. According to investigators, this was likely an opportunistic predator who selected Al simply to satisfy a craving for violence. They believed that he would have done this to any person who had agreed to rent a room to him and handed over the keys. Al just happened to be the unlucky person who went through with the deal. Over the years, various theories have emerged about who Robert Cooper really was. Some suspect he was a professional hitman or ex-military operative, given his discipline and meticulous planning. Others theorize an international connection, noting the unusual foot whipping method and hints of an Eastern European background. Another view is that he was an uncaught serial predator who had honed his skills on other victims. In favor of this, the way he canvassed multiple rental homes suggests a predator searching for the perfect target. Even though the trail is cold, the case remains open. Investigators have also turned to new technology in hopes of finally unmasking the perpetrator. In 2017, Aurora police released a DNA-based composite image of the suspect, showing what he might have looked like at various stages in life. Notably, he presented himself as various ages to the people he met, so his exact age is unknown. The DNA analysis suggested the suspect had fair skin and European ancestry, consistent with witness impressions. Unfortunately, the specifics of his European ancestry haven't been publicly released, though I suspect that this is because this is an active and ongoing investigation. The authorities have retained a genetic genealogy company in relation to this crime and may currently be working on building out his family tree. One theory I've considered is that the drop of blood found at the crime scene wasn't accidental at all, but intentionally placed there by the perp as a red herring. Given the extremely meticulous nature of the crime, leaving behind a single drop of blood feels strangely inconsistent. It's plausible Robert Cooper planted this blood, knowing authorities would latch onto it as a definitive clue. By introducing DNA from someone entirely unrelated, he could have effectively diverted the investigation down a false path. Authorities have been relying heavily on this DNA sample to identify their suspect, confident it's the key to solving the case. It's unsettling to consider, but entirely possible, that this small drop of blood was yet another trick played by this chameleon predator. While I clearly find this theory compelling, it does have its weaknesses. Transporting someone else's blood without contaminating it with your own DNA is a risk. The smallest mistake could result in a mixed sample, which would raise immediate red flags for investigators. Sourcing the blood is another major hurdle. Unless the perpetrator had access to medical waste, vulnerable individuals, or illicit sources, obtaining a viable and uncontaminated sample would be logistically complex and risky. I feel I'm also obliged to mention Occam's razor here. The simplest and most likely explanation is that the perpetrator was injured during the attack and unknowingly left a trace behind. That said, I'm not sure to what degree Occam's razor can be applied to this case, due to the fact that we know Robert Cooper engaged in multiple layers of deception. In a quote-unquote normal case, mentioning that the unknown DNA profile found at the scene could be from someone else would basically be absurd. But the slaying of Al Kite by this unknown sinister figure is no normal case. Not even close. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just shouting out all my subscribers, members, and patrons. Also gotta take a moment to plug Lazy Chill True Crime, which is available on YouTube itself or in audio form as a podcast. Just search up Lazy Chill True Crime on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. In June 1976, 18-year-old David Stack set out to hitchhike from Broomfield, Colorado to California. He was a recent high school graduate with a free-spirited, adventurous personality and a knack for making friends wherever he went. David came from a large family and hoped to visit his siblings in Northern California, including a brother who worked as a carpenter there. With little money on hand, he chose to hitch rides across the West, a common practice in the 1970s, when many people saw hitchhiking as a relatively safe way to travel. Of course, as we know now, this once common practice ended up being exploited by predators. On June 1st, 1976, David departed with a backpack, optimistic about the road ahead. As the weeks passed with no word from David, his family grew deeply concerned. His relatives in California confirmed that he never arrived, and at first his parents and siblings tried to remain hopeful. They wondered if David might have changed plans, gone on a side adventure, or simply taken longer than expected. But by midsummer, it was very clear that something was very wrong. Unbeknownst to his loved ones, David's journey had come to a tragic end in Utah. On June 10, 1976, a worker at a landfill near Wendover, on the border with Nevada, discovered the body of a young man. Authorities in Toole County responded and began investigating the death. The victim was a white male around 17 to 20 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair and brown eyes. He wore a tan shirt, patched blue jeans, and a black belt, but he had no identification on him. The medical examiner noted the young man's build and features, including a small scar on his forehead and a slight deformity in one toe. For investigators at the time, however, none of these clues were enough to reveal the young man's name. In hindsight, those details would later line up with David Stack's description. The autopsy revealed he met a violent end, with 2 bullet holes noted in the John Doe's skull. Investigators kept the specific detail of the wounds secret from the public, a strategy often used to filter out false leads. They announced only that a John Doe had been found slain near Wendover. Police canvassed the area and learned that a hitchhiker resembling the victim was reportedly seen in town on June 9th, the day before the body was found. It appeared that David made it that far west, likely catching rides along Interstate 80, but somewhere near the Utah-Nevada border, he met a deadly fate. Initial efforts to identify the slain teenager were unsuccessful. In the 1970s, there were no national databases linking missing persons with unidentified remains. Despite being in the next state over, the description of the John Doe in Utah never made its way to authorities in Colorado at the time, so nobody connected the dots. With no name and no suspects, the investigation stalled. The unknown young man was buried in a pauper's grave in Toole County, and the case went cold. For decades, David Stack's family endured the pain of not knowing what happened to him. His parents and siblings never stopped wondering if he might be alive somewhere. Year after year, they held out hope, and David's mother passed away in 2011, still believing her son could return one day. The family's search was made harder by the fact that David's case had no leads whatsoever. He was simply last seen heading west, and then he vanished. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation kept his case on file, and the family continued to publicize his story in hopes of a lead, but nothing surfaced. Over the years, information about David's disappearance slowly made its way into various police files and missing persons networks. Likewise, the unidentified Toole County John Doe case remained on file in Utah, though without anyone to advocate for him in that capacity. This case received little attention. In 2010, the unidentified victims' details were entered into the Name Us database, a centralized repository designed to match missing people with unknown remains across the country. This was and remains a game changer that can connect cases with just a few keystrokes, something that had been virtually unimaginable in the 1970s. It would prove crucial, but the pieces didn't fall into place immediately. In 2014, 2 cold case detectives in Utah revisited the old John Doe file and used Name Us to search for potential matches. David Stack's profile surfaced. He was the right age, had vanished in 1976 while hitchhiking, and his physical description was similar to the unknown victim. Investigators compared dental records from the John Doe with David's dental records that were on file. The similarities were striking enough that in May 2015, the authorities exhumed the unknown body from its grave to obtain DNA samples. David's siblings provided their DNA for comparison as well. After a few weeks of analysis, The results confirmed what detectives had strongly suspected. In August 2015, authorities publicly announced that the John Doe found in Utah back in 1976 was indeed David Stack. Nearly 39 years after his death, David finally got his name back, and these two previously unconnected cases fully intersected. The news brought a mix of heartbreak and closure to his family. They were devastated to finally have confirmation of the painful fate they had long feared. Still, they were grateful to at least know the truth, and to be able to reclaim David's remains for a proper burial. His body was returned to his family, and he was finally laid to rest under his own name. With David's identity established, the case was officially reopened in 2015. Investigators now had new avenues to explore, and they could attempt to retrace David's path. They could connect the two files and try to find witnesses who might remember seeing him, or recall any suspicious individuals on the road that summer. The challenge, however, was enormous given the passage of time, and as of now, it appears that no further meaningful leads have ever been found in this matter. No perpetrator has ever been publicly identified, and the motive for this brutal attack remains entirely unknown. There are several theories about what might have happened. The most likely scenario is that David accepted a ride from someone who then turned violent. It could have been a robbery, or something much darker, that ended in a slaying. Unfortunately, these sorts of predators like to target young hitchhikers during this time period. Some even speculate that he might have fallen victim to a serial predator who preyed on hitchhikers in that era. Perhaps just as disturbingly, it may well have been a solitary act of violence by a stranger passing through the area. Unfortunately, the final pieces of the puzzle for justice in David Stack's story remain out of reach. Given the lack of additional forensic evidence, it now appears that the best opportunity to truly resolve this case would be if someone remembers something they saw in 1976. Heather Sellers was a 20-year-old woman living with family in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She had some previous troubles with addiction, but according to her family, she had gotten her life together in the previous year. On September 24, 2002, Heather's grandmother dropped her off for an evening shift at the Waffle House near Highway 9 and Interstate 85. Heather carried an overnight bag, planning to stay at her aunt's house after work. Tragically, she never made it home that night. After finishing work, Heather met up with her ex-fiancé, 22-year-old Jonathan Vick. They had broken off their engagement just 2 weeks earlier, but were still seeing each other despite the breakup. That evening, the two visited two local bars, a place called the Rainbow Lounge and another called Cocktails and Dreams. Those outings were the last confirmed sightings of Heather. She never returned to her aunt's, and she never showed up to collect her last paycheck at the Waffle House. Heather's family realized immediately that something was wrong when she failed to come home or call. Disappearing without a word was completely out of character for her. Heather was in regular touch with her relatives and wouldn't drop out of contact like that. Alarmed, her family reported her missing to the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Office and quickly mobilized to search. They contacted friends, drove along Heather's usual routes, and put up missing person flyers around town. Despite these efforts, the early searches turned up nothing, no clues to what happened at all. From the start, Jonathan Vick became the primary focus of the investigation. He was the last person known to have seen Heather alive, as witnesses had spotted them together on the night she disappeared. Heather and Vick's relationship had been tumultuous, and she had confided to family that Vick was abusive during their time together. Further, their breakup 2 weeks before had been extremely tense, and she advised her family that she was scared. Naturally, detectives questioned Vic right away, and he denied any involvement and claimed he didn't know where Heather went that night. With no physical evidence in the early stages and no body, police couldn't charge him, but their suspicion remained. Investigators also considered other possibilities. For a time, they looked at a potential connection to another missing woman in the area. One of Heather's co-workers at the Waffle House, 32-year-old Michelle Whitaker, had vanished in August 2002, just a month before Heather. This coincidence raised fears of a serial predator and even speculation that Vic might somehow be involved in both cases. However, in 2008, Whitaker was found alive and well. She had left the state voluntarily and was apparently unaware that people back home thought she was missing. In October 2005, 3 years after Heather vanished, a dramatic turn of events cast new suspicion on Vic. That fall, Jonathan Vick was arrested and charged with an unrelated crime: the 1995 slaying of a local woman named Dana Satterfield. Satterfield, a 27-year-old hairdresser, had been slain in her Roebuck, South Carolina beauty salon. In 2006, Vick was convicted of that slaying and sentenced to life in prison. For Heather's loved ones and the authorities, this revelation was chilling. It confirmed that the man they suspected in her disappearance was undeniably capable of truly evil and heinous acts. Following Vick's conviction, Spartanburg authorities revisited Heather's cold case. In 2006, they discovered an abandoned car that had been registered to Vick, and inside it they found bloodstains and a few strands of long blonde hair. Investigators indicated that this evidence was believed to belong to Heather, though it's unclear from the sources what forensic testing was done at that time. That said, it was the most significant clue yet, potentially suggesting that Heather met with foul play at the hands of Jonathan Vick. Even so, the evidence alone wasn't enough to bring charges. By way of reminder, the prosecution only gets one shot to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, on the other hand, has to prove absolutely nothing whatsoever. It may be helpful for their case to attempt to push back the evidence of the prosecution, but there are no reverse onuses placed upon the defendant in our legal system. The inherent problem with the bloodstains and a hair strand being found in Vick's vehicle is that she had been his girlfriend. It doesn't take a brilliant defense attorney to see how a plausible, innocent explanation for the presence of these materials could exist. To complicate matters even further, strictly speaking, the only evidence that Heather is deceased is circumstantial. Notably, the authorities thought the same and emphasized that they couldn't move forward without more definitive proof. Today, Jonathan Vick remains the prime suspect in Heather Sellers' disappearance. Nearly all signs point to him, from Heather's troubled history with Vick to the fact he was last with her, and the apparent traces of her blood in his vehicle. Alternative theories have been explored, but they seem less likely, both to the authorities and to casual observers such as myself. Some have wondered if Heather might have simply left town due to her fear of Vick and simply didn't let anyone know, so as to minimize any chance that she'd be tracked down. Theoretically, it's possible that she did this for the protection of the people around her as well, as Vick was capable of extreme violence and had threatened her. She may have been worried that giving anyone her location could make those people targets for reprisals as well. However, this of course is just speculation, and there's no evidence to indicate that this was the case. This narrative is also challenged by the fact that she could have come forward after Vick was convicted, though perhaps she had established a new and separate identity by that point. Another theory revolves around Heather's history of substance use. While she was reported to be clean at the time of her disappearance, witnesses reported believing that she was under the influence on the night in question. This has led some to believe that she may have suffered from an accidental overdose. As of 2025, the disappearance of Heather Sellers is still unsolved. If she's alive, Heather would be 42 years old today, though sadly the consensus is that she almost certainly isn't. Nozomi Momoi was born in Tokyo in 1978 and rose to fame in Japan's plot-optional film industry during the early 2000s. She became a prolific entertainer in this scene, appearing in over 100 film releases within about a year. By 2002, however, Nozomi was growing tired of the relentless filming schedule and considering a shift to a more traditional acting career. Friends later revealed that she planned to get married, leave the saucy screen circuit, and pursue work as a stage actress. At 24 years old, Nozomi Momoi seemed poised to start a new chapter in life, but that was all about to go disturbingly wrong. On October 12, 2002, while visiting friends in Nagano Prefecture, Nozomi's life met a tragic end. Shortly before 9 p.m. that night, a passerby in the city of Shiojiri spotted a car on fire by a remote riverbank along the Narai River and called emergency services. Firefighters arrived and doused the flames, only to uncover a horrifying scene. 2 bodies were found, one inside the scorched vehicle and one on the ground a short distance away. Despite severe burns on both, authorities soon identified the victims. The woman was Nozomi Momoi, and the man was her companion on the trip, a 24-year-old acquaintance named Hiroki Sakai, who worked at a local car dealership. Evidence indicated that Nozomi had been slain before the fire. An autopsy found she suffered from 6 stab wounds. Her body had then been doused in a flammable liquid and set ablaze, seemingly to destroy evidence of the crime. Hiroki's remains were discovered in the car's back seat, burned so badly that examiners couldn't immediately determine his exact cause of death. Investigators did notice a knife, believed to have been used in the commission of the crime, lying near Hiroki's left hand inside the car, even though he was right-handed. This odd detail hinted that the scene may have been staged. From the start, the scene's strange circumstances puzzled investigators. It was baffling that Nozomi's body lay outside the car while Hiroki's was inside. Initially, police ruled that this was a mutual pact between the couple, ensuring that they would depart the world together. This was how things looked at first glance. Nozomi had been stabbed, and Hiroki appeared to have died in the burning car. As evidence emerged, however, this theory started to crumble quickly. Crucially, the autopsy showed that neither victim had inhaled much smoke, meaning Nozomi and Hiroki were likely dead or unconscious before the fire started. Such findings pointed to the disturbing likelihood of a third-party perp who had slain the couple and then set the car on fire to hide the crime. Investigators quickly tried to piece together what the two had been up to that night. It appeared Nozomi and Hiroki had left his home shortly before the incident, and they departed in a rush. At the residence, officers found the couple's shoes still by the door and a computer left running with the monitor on, as if the two intended to return shortly. These signs suggested they did not plan to disappear or die that evening. Instead, something urgent or unexpected drew them out. Despite all the inconsistencies, the authorities decided to close the investigation, a fact that would prove highly controversial. Hiroki's parents, unconvinced that their son was the perpetrator, urged authorities to continue investigating the case as if they had been slain by an as yet unknown perpetrator. In November 2002, about a month after the deaths, his family filed a formal complaint asserting that a third-party slaying had occurred. By January 2003, Prosecutors reclassified the case as an open investigation into the slayings of both individuals rather than a closed case. Despite this significant step, the case stalled out with no apparent leads. With no suspects identified, Hiroki's parents also pursued a civil route to seek some form of justice. They sued Hiroki's life insurance company, which had refused to pay out benefits because of the authorities' original ruling on the case. This lawsuit led to a dramatic turn, and in early 2007, the Nagano District Court issued a landmark ruling. It found that based on the evidence, Nozomi and Hiroki's deaths were likely caused by a third party, and ordered the insurer to pay the benefits. While this didn't directly impact the criminal investigation, the 2007 ruling validated the family's doubts and put added pressure on law enforcement to find the perpetrator. Several inconsistencies in the case supported the theory that an outside assailant was responsible. Nozomi and Hiroki left in the middle of normal activities. They were found shoeless at the scene, and their shoes were later located back at the home they'd left. This may be a controversial take on my part, but in general, people don't voluntarily leave their homes without shoes on. Additionally, that computer in the house was still running, with the monitor on, suggesting they expected to return. Personally, I don't find this quite as compelling, as I often leave my computer on when I plan to go out even for a few hours. Also, if they had intended to end themselves in some sort of pact that night, I highly doubt they were too concerned about their computer or their power bill. Still, the cops and journalists found this to be a very odd fact, so perhaps there's some cultural context I'm not understanding here. Another major factor was the position of the bodies. Nozomi's body was found outside the car, while Hiroki's was inside the vehicle, in the back seat. If Hiroki had been the attacker, I find it odd that he would leave Nozomi outside and then climb back into his car to die in the fire. If it really was a pact, where this couple was to perish together, why wouldn't they just stay in the vehicle together? This hints that the victims were likely placed by another party. The weapon being found near Hiroki's left hand also hints at the possibility of the scene being staged. That said, though, it's possible that he held the item in his offhand after the commission of the crime, and it fell from there during the fire. Alternatively, this odd position may have been the result of him flailing during the fire itself. Further, the fire appears to have been used as a cover-up, which, if the initial hypothesis was correct, there'd be nothing to cover up regardless. Crucially, an accelerant was used to torch the car, yet no gasoline container was recovered at the scene, which to me implies the culprit took it. Coupled with the autopsy finding of almost no smoke in the victim's lungs, this suggests the fire was set after the slayings to cover up the crime. Investigators later discovered that a few months before the incident, Hiroki had lent about 800,000 yen to someone, but the person named on the IOU did not actually exist. At the time, this was about $6,500, a significant sum that this individual may not have been willing or able to pay back. This odd find hints that Hiroki was conned, and it raises the possibility that the meeting on the night of the crime was a setup related to that fake loan. It's possible that the couple were lured out that night and slain as a way to wipe this debt clean, but surprisingly, that's not the darkest theory of this case. One theory that continues to circulate in discussions surrounding Nozomi Momoi is that she may have been targeted specifically because she was seeking a new line of work. Nozomi was actively planning a significant career shift, transitioning from the provocative limelight of late-night cinema into a more mainstream and socially accepted acting sphere. Notably, however, she was still at the height of her career and was generating significant income for those producing her brand of direct-to-video entertainment. This change might have posed a threat or disappointment to certain powerful industry figures who had financial stakes in her career. It's been speculated that by stepping away, Nozomi may have inadvertently disrupted ongoing agreements, or perhaps angered someone who felt betrayed or financially slighted. In an industry known for Yakuza involvement, this clearly isn't out of the realm of possibility. Supporters of this theory point to the strange and staged nature of the crime scene, suggesting it was intended as a stark warning to others who might contemplate similar exits. Others indicate that the scene, with no forensic evidence left behind, suggests that Nozomi and her friend had been taken as part of a professional job. This, of course, would suggest the involvement of organized crime. Hiroki may have been an unwitting patsy, lured to the scene, and positioned to take the fall for Nozomi's carefully staged slaying. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just plugging Lazy Chill True Crime, which is available on YouTube itself or in audio form as a podcast. Just search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts, and you've just unlocked a whole bunch of new content. On a cold January night in 1987, 17-year-old Joe Helt set out with friends in the small town of Ellenville, New York, and was never seen again. Helt was a typical teenager in the Hudson Valley, known for his easygoing nature and love of rock music. He lived with his mother and siblings in Ellenville, a quiet village nestled below the Shawangunk Mountains. On Friday, January 16, 1987, Joe joined dozens of local teens at a popular hangout at the abandoned Mount Cathalia Ski Lodge in the nearby hamlet of Craigsmoor. What began as a night of casual partying would soon turn into one of the region's most enduring mysteries. As the evening wore on at the crumbling ski lodge, Joe Helt spent time mingling with friends. At one point, he got into a heated argument with three acquaintances: 21-year-old J.P. LaForge, 18-year-old Wade Marks, and 16-year-old Kelly Diaz. The conflict grew intense. Witnesses later recalled other partygoers drifting away, fearing the dispute might become physical. Despite this tension, Joe eventually left the party with those same three people he had been in conflict with, climbing into LaForge's Subaru for a late-night drive. The group decided to head up a mountain road toward Sam's Point, an area of Minnewaska State Park known for its icy caves and rugged terrain. In the early morning hours of January 17th, their car became stuck in deep snow along a loop road by Lake Maritanza near the Sam's Point Preserve Gatehouse. The three friends later told police that around 3:30 a.m., Joe grew frustrated by their failed attempts to free the car and declared he would walk home. Ellenville was about 5 miles down the mountain, a long trek on a winter night for Joe, who wasn't wearing proper gear. According to the three friends, Joe set off alone into the darkness while they stayed behind. About 20 minutes later, Wade Marks and Kelly Diaz abandoned the stranded car as well, walking in the same direction to Marks's house roughly 2 miles away. John LaForge told investigators he waited another 10 minutes by himself, before also trudging off to his home about 1.5 miles from the scene. It was below freezing, the middle of the night, and the mountain was silent and dark. All three made it safely back to their respective homes. Joe Helt, however, never made it off the mountain, and he vanished into the frigid wilderness, leaving no trace behind. When Joe failed to show up for work the next evening, his family realized something was wrong. Joe's mother, Lee Ann, had assumed he'd stayed over with friends after the party, but when his employer called saying Joe hadn't arrived for his shift, panic set in. Joe wasn't the sort of teenager who simply wouldn't show up for work. The Ellenville police were notified on January 17th that the teen was missing, and a massive search effort was launched that very night. State police, forest rangers, local police officers, volunteer firefighters, tracking dogs, and even a helicopter crew mobilized to scour the mountainous area. For 6 days they combed the wilderness, focusing on the rocky trails, caves, and wooded ravines near the spot where Joe was last seen. It wasn't long, however, before nature made the search even more difficult. A heavy winter storm swept into the region that weekend, dumping over 2 feet of snow across the area. Blinding blizzards and snowdrifts impeded progress and raised fears that Joe, if lost and injured, couldn't have survived long in the elements. After nearly a week of fruitless effort, with roads becoming impassable, officials had to suspend the active search. When spring arrived and the snow melted, search teams returned to canvass the mountain again, hoping to find any sign of Joe, but nothing ever turned up. In the investigation that followed, police questioned the 3 friends who were last with Joe. Initially, LaForge, Marks, and Diaz were considered persons of interest, and rumors swirled in the local community about what might have happened on that mountain road. Yet law enforcement could find no hard evidence of foul play. The 3 young friends claimed Joe simply walked off into the night, and no one reported witnessing any crime. Simply put, there was no proof that any crime whatsoever had even occurred. With no body, no witnesses beyond the 3, and no physical clues, Joe's case languished. From early on, there were 2 leading theories about what happened to Joseph Helt: a tragic accident amid hazardous conditions, or foul play at the hands of the people he was with. The accident hypothesis suggests that Joe, disoriented on a frigid night, may have stumbled into the unforgiving terrain of the region. The landscape atop the Shawangunk Ridge is treacherous, dotted with crevices, caves, and steep cliffs hidden by brush, and in winter, often obscured by snow and ice. A popular idea is that Joe could have slipped into one of the deep ice caves or fallen from a ledge while trying to find his way home. If he succumbed to hypothermia or an injury in a remote crag before the snowstorm, his body might have been quickly buried by snowfall and hidden from rescuers. It's worth noting that Lake Maritanza, the high-elevation lake near where the car was stuck, was frozen at the time. This raises the possibility that Joe fell through ice, though no evidence ever indicated this. However, a second, more sinister theory has persisted, that Joe Helt met with foul play that night. Suspicion has long swirled around the 3 companions who were with him in the car. The fact that Joe had argued with LaForge, Marks, and Diaz at the party raised red flags for his family and friends. Some have suggested that conflict could have reignited after they drove off together, leading to a confrontation on the snowy mountain road. That said, ultimately, there's nothing to support this scenario, and it remains entirely speculative. On a chilly March night in 1923, a Buick coupe sat abandoned on a downtown St. Louis street corner. Its engine was cold and its driver missing. Police towed it with little fanfare until they learned the car belonged to a Catholic priest from Illinois who had vanished. The disappearance of Father John Raniak soon gripped the region and became one of the era's most haunting unsolved mysteries. John Raniak was not the kind of man anyone expected to vanish. At 28, he was a beloved priest in the small town of Virden, Illinois. Born in 1895 to Slovak immigrants, John grew up in a devout family and felt an early calling to the church. He was ordained in 1917 and assigned to Virden's Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where he quickly became a pillar of the community. He was cheerful, energetic, and devoted to his parishioners. He lived with his mother and siblings and spent his days ministering to families and organizing community events. By 1923, Father John seemed happy and settled, and nothing in his life hinted at the possibility that he would simply disappear. Monday, March 5th, 1923, began as a routine day for Father Raniak. He set out on the 85-mile drive from Virden to St. Louis to purchase supplies for a church bazaar. He often combined such errands with visits to friends, and that day he hoped to see Father Vincent Linneck, a close pal serving at a St. Louis parish. John left Verdun in the morning driving his gray Buick. He arrived in St. Louis before noon and stopped at Father Linneck's home, but his friend wasn't there. John left a note and proceeded downtown to do his shopping. Witnesses later recalled seeing the young priest calmly buying goods in the afternoon, around 2:30 p.m. Once he'd completed his errands, he headed back toward Illinois, planning to be home that night as promised. We know Father John made it part way. In Venice, Illinois, just across the river from St. Louis, a mechanic reported that John stopped at his garage for a quick car repair early that evening. The priest continued on his way after the fix, but that brief encounter in Venice was the last time anyone saw Father Raniak. When Father John did not return home on Monday night, worry began to spread in Virden. It was unlike him to be out of contact, and by Tuesday morning, his family and parishioners were anxious. Phone calls to friends and neighboring parishes turned up no sign of him. On Wednesday, March 7th, a group of concerned Verdun residents traveled to St. Louis to report the priest missing and help search. Only then did a crucial clue emerge, and the police realized that they had already found Father John's car before anyone knew he was missing. Inside the vehicle, investigators found disturbing signs. Papers belonging to the priest were scattered on the front seat, as if someone had rifled through them or there had been a struggle. One was a bill for a film ironically titled The Victim. More chilling was what someone had left in the back seat area of the vehicle. Scratched into the paint were the words, "We won." These two words, gouged in 6-inch letters, felt like a cruel taunt from whoever had taken Father John. Police also noticed mud and bits of cornstalk clinging to the undercarriage, suggesting the car had been driven off-road into farm fields. And tellingly, the St. Christopher medal that John kept in his car, a patron saint charm for safe travel, was missing, its clasp pried empty. It seemed clear that somewhere after leaving St. Louis, the priest had met with foul play. The mystery of the missing priest captured headlines, and law enforcement from Missouri and Illinois mobilized. Search parties scoured the roadsides and woods along Father John's route. Volunteers dragged the river shallows and checked every ditch, well, and ravine where a body might be. But aside from the ominous clues in the car, nothing was found. Father John had vanished without a trace. With publicity came a flood of tips and a fair share of false leads. In early April, a St. Louis newspaper published a sensational claim that Father Raniak had been living a double life as an armed robber. Unsurprisingly, no evidence ever turned up to indicate that this mild-mannered priest had turned to banditry. Another tip, a telegram demanding a ransom and claiming the priest would be returned safely, also turned out to be a hoax. In the absence of answers, theories swirled. One idea was that Father John might have disappeared by choice, abandoning his clerical life. Those who knew him vehemently rejected this, and he had given no indication of despair or desire to leave. Suspects were investigated, but no evidence turned up in relation to any of them. The most ominous suspect was a man named Andrew Rolando. Rolando was a fugitive who was known for what was euphemistically called at the time anti-Catholic sentiment. And by anti-Catholic sentiment, I'm underselling what he did here in a massive way. He was already wanted for slaying a priest in another state in 1921. It was easy to imagine that this dangerous man might have crossed paths with Father Raniak on that fateful evening. Yet, like all other leads, nothing definitive came of it, and Rolando was never caught or questioned in connection with the case, and there was no hard proof he was involved. That said, he was confirmed to be in the area at the time. Despite the incredible passage of time, there is faint hope that this case will one day be solved. Father Raniak's remains may have been found years ago, and he may be known in some other context as a John Doe, just waiting to have his name returned to him. Genetic genealogy may one day be able to prove this priest is one of the nation's innumerable John Does just waiting to be identified. A remote Japanese island, a lonely hike up a volcano, and then nothing, ever again. In April 2009, American poet Craig Arnold disappeared while exploring Kuchino-Arabujima, a tiny volcanic island in the south of Japan. The 41-year-old Arnold, a professor and adventurer, vanished, leaving behind only a trail of footprints and a mystery that endures to this day. To understand how Craig Arnold came to be on that far-flung island, it's important to first know who he was. He was widely regarded as an incredibly gifted poet and had won a number of awards for his work, including the extremely prestigious Fulbright Scholarship. By 2009, Arnold was a respected professor at the University of Wyoming and a well-known figure in poetry and intellectual circles. Arnold also had a spirit for adventure. He was a self-proclaimed volcano enthusiast, drawn to extreme places where others seldom go. He had traveled the world visiting active volcanoes and turning those experiences into poems and essays. By early 2009, he embarked on his most ambitious voyage yet, a 5-month fellowship in Japan to write about the nation's volcanoes. As he journeyed through the Japanese archipelago, he chronicled his impressions on a blog entitled Volcano Pilgrim, 5 Months in Japan as a Wandering Poet. On this trip, Arnold's fascination with nature's raw power was on full display. The day before his disappearance, he mused in his blog about how the rush of imminent danger can sharpen one's perspective on life. In hindsight, those words felt eerily prophetic. One of his friends later noted that Arnold, despite his experience, could become so engrossed in exploration that he might lose track of his surroundings. In late April 2009, Arnold traveled to Kuchino-Arabujima, a remote, sparsely populated island dominated by an active volcano. On April 27th, he set out alone from his inn to hike up Mount Shindake, the island's active volcano, presumably eager to explore its steaming craters and panoramic views. The terrain on the island was perilous, with dense vegetation, unofficial trails, and hidden cliffs, making it easy to lose one's way, or worse. When Arnold didn't return that evening, concern quickly grew. The next day, Japanese authorities launched a search mission. By law, official search and rescue operations in Japan typically last only 3 days. Rescuers combed the woods and slopes using dogs and even a helicopter. The island's dense bamboo thickets made the search arduous, and after 3 days there was still no sign of the missing poet. His cell phone remained unreachable, and attempts to ping its GPS signal via his Japanese provider also proved fruitless. With no success in the initial sweep, Arnold's family and friends refused to give up. After the official efforts wound down, Arnold's family enlisted the help of an international search and rescue team. Eventually, they discovered a faint trail potentially left by Arnold, leading toward a steep, hazardous cliff high on the volcano. Signs in the disturbed soil and foliage suggested that he had slipped near the edge, possibly after sustaining a leg injury that impeded his balance. The evidence pointed to a tragic conclusion. Arnold had fallen from a great height and almost certainly did not survive. Still, the story of Craig Arnold's disappearance leaves a lingering aura of mystery. The official conclusion is clear. He met with a fatal accident on the volcano. Others have floated more unlikely theories, from foul play to an intentional disappearance, but no evidence has ever emerged to support any scenario other than a tragic accident. Ultimately, the consensus aligns with the simplest explanation. Craig Arnold's final adventure turned out to be far more dangerous than he anticipated, leading to an untimely end. On June 2, 2015, a routine rafting expedition through the Grand Canyon turned into a baffling mystery. Morgan Heimer, a 22-year-old river guide from Cody, Wyoming, was leading a commercial rafting trip along the Colorado River. Heimer was an experienced outdoorsman, a strong swimmer, and a seasoned guide familiar with the canyon's perils. That afternoon, day 6 of an 8-day trip, the group stopped near a landmark called Pumpkin Springs at River Mile 213 for a side hike and some cliff jumping fun. As clients took turns leaping from a low rock ledge into the water, Heimer assisted them, ensuring everyone's safety. Once the last client had jumped, Heimer mentioned to the lead guide that he was going to take a short break while they prepared to head back to the boats. The lead guide stepped away briefly to speak with a guest, but when he turned around, Morgan was nowhere to be seen. At first, no one panicked, and it was assumed that Heimer had simply wandered off for a moment of solitude or to relax out of the sun. He was last observed at approximately 4 p.m., standing on that riverside ledge with his guide gear on, including a life vest. He was also carrying a distinctive purple water bottle, which the park officials hoped would be a significant clue going forward. There was no splash, no cry for help, no obvious sign of an accident. One moment he was part of the group, and the next he had vanished almost into thin air. Hours passed with the team assuming their guide would reappear after his break. It wasn't until around 7 p.m., when Morgan failed to show up at camp for dinner, that serious concern set in. The other party members searched the immediate area, calling out his name and scanning the river's edge, but there was no trace of Morgan. As dusk fell with still no sign of the young guide, the group realized something was very wrong and placed a satellite phone call to park authorities to report him missing. Early the next morning, Grand Canyon National Park rangers launched a major search and rescue operation. A helicopter crew flew to the area at first light on June 3rd, inserting rangers near the spot where Morgan was last seen. 3 ground teams fanned out along the rocky banks, while a boat team scoured the river. Searchers faced grueling conditions and the summer heat was extremely intense. Despite these challenges, they combed diligently through an extensive area, covering roughly a 14-mile stretch of river and about 4 miles of adjacent land around Pumpkin Springs. They looked for any clue: a piece of clothing, footprints, his purple water bottle, or the dark life vest that might have been caught on rocks or river debris. When initial sweeps found nothing, the search radius was expanded westward downriver toward the Diamond Creek takeout. This is a popular exit point for rafting trips about 12 miles beyond where Morgan disappeared. The idea was to ensure that if he had been carried downstream, no stretch of riverbank would be left uninspected. Interviews were conducted with everyone on the trip, and even with other river groups who had been in the area, in case someone had seen something that might help explain what happened. But day after day, the canyon yielded no secrets. There were no signs of a struggle or an animal encounter, and no evidence that Heimer had attempted to hike out of the canyon on foot. By June 8th, after 6 full days of intensive searching by air, water, and land, not a single clue to Morgan's fate had turned up. With heavy hearts, officials made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. The search was transitioned to a limited mode, meaning rangers and pilots would keep an eye out for any telltale signs during routine patrols, but the large-scale hunt was suspended. Morgan Heimer's disappearance left both investigators and loved ones grasping for answers. Here was a capable guide, intimately familiar with the dangers of the river, equipped with a life jacket and survival knowledge. yet he had vanished without leaving even a footprint behind. In the immediate aftermath, the working theory was that Morgan must have somehow fallen into the Colorado River and drowned, his body likely swept away by the strong current. This theory made sense to many. The river was swift and powerful, and even with a personal flotation device, an accident in certain rapids or whirlpools could pin a person underwater. If he was caught in an underwater crevice or entangled in debris, his remains might not surface for a long time, if ever. Rescuers noted that given Morgan's skills and fitness, they initially believed he would be easy to find, which made the complete lack of results even more troubling. As days passed with no sign of him, the presumption of a fatal water accident grew stronger, simply because no other scenario had any supporting evidence. In the absence of answers, several theories persist among those who follow the case. The prevailing theory remains that Morgan fell into the Colorado River and succumbed to a tragic accident. Perhaps he lost his footing on the wet rock, or got too close to the edge, and the river's swift current did the rest. If so, the Colorado may have carried him far downstream, or pinned him in a submerged pocket, explaining why extensive searches failed to recover a body or even a piece of gear. Another theory, harder to reconcile with Morgan's expertise, is that he ventured briefly into the wild and got fatally lost or injured. Did he step inland for just a moment to find a private spot or to take in the view, and then suffer a fall in the labyrinth of cliffs and crevices set back from the water's edge? The area is remote and unforgiving. Even a short walk away from the group could turn treacherous if one slips into a hidden ravine or encounters an unseen hazard. Yet, considering Morgan's familiarity with wilderness terrain, this makes this more unlikely. After all, he was acutely aware of such dangers, much more so than the average person. Moreover, the intensive land search found no trace of him in the surrounding quarter-mile radius of the canyon, where such an accident would likely occur. This theory, while not completely impossible, leaves many park officials skeptical, given the lack of any supporting evidence. Other more sinister activities have also been suggested, from foul play to potential supernatural explanations. However, neither of these theories have any evidence to back them up, and they remain highly speculative. Today, nearly a decade later, the disappearance of Morgan Heimer remains an open case and an enduring heartbreak for his family, friends, and the tight-knit river guide community. The National Park Service keeps Morgan on their list of cold cases, and the investigation remains officially ongoing in a limited capacity. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in downtown Cleveland on March 24, 2013, 53-year-old Eliza Sherman walked toward her divorce attorney's office, expecting a routine meeting. Instead, she was ambushed and brutally stabbed just steps from the entrance in broad daylight. A grainy surveillance camera clip offered the only glimpse of the perpetrator, a blurred, masked figure dressed in dark clothing sprinting away from the scene. The motive behind this case, if the prosecution's allegations are correct, will go down as one of the most unusual motives in American criminal justice history. Detectives quickly honed in on Eliza's personal life for possible motives. The victim had been in the midst of a messy divorce with her estranged husband, Sanford Sherman, at the time of her death. This bitter legal battle had dragged on for years, and friends later recounted that Eliza was afraid and just wanted it over with. Naturally, Sanford came under scrutiny, but when police attempted to interview him, he refused to cooperate, hiring an attorney who shielded him from questioning. Investigators could never formally label him a suspect, and with no direct evidence tying him to the attack, that lead hit a dead end. Years later, Sanford would pass away in Florida, never having answered detectives' questions. The cloud of suspicion remained, but if he knew more about Eliza's death, he took those secrets to his grave. Under normal conditions, the authorities may have spent way more in the way of resources investigating Sanford, but this case was anything but normal. Another early focus of the investigation was Eliza's own divorce attorney, Gregory Moore, the very man she was on her way to meet. Almost immediately, something about Moore's behavior didn't sit right with Eliza's friends or the police. Eliza's best friend later revealed that on the day of the attack, Moore had oddly kept changing the meeting time and location for their appointment. This constant rescheduling raised questions about whether Eliza had been deliberately lured into a trap, and this is where things get really weird. Moore told investigators that he hadn't been at his downtown office at the time of the attack, but was somewhere else entirely. They found this to be unusual given that this is where he was supposed to meet his client at that exact time. Deepening suspicions, forensic analysis of cell phone records and building entry logs would later catch him in a web of deceit. Moore had sent text messages to Eliza just moments before and after the attack, claiming he was waiting inside his office, contrary to what he told the cops. Yet investigators discovered he was not actually in the building at that time based on the building entry logs. This contradiction was alarming. Eliza's own attorney had attempted to fabricate some sort of alibi, while also telling an obvious verifiable lie to the authorities. At the crime scene, other strange clues, or lack thereof, emerged. Besides the blurry video footage, physical evidence was scant. The attacker had been quick and efficient, leaving behind no weapon, and initially, no identifiable DNA or fingerprints. But investigators did notice anomalies that suggested a premeditated effort, likely involving multiple people. Critical surveillance footage from the building, about 20 minutes worth, had mysteriously been deleted immediately after the attack. Similarly, voicemails from the building's calling system, which Eliza might have used to reach Moore upon arrival, were found to have been erased. Taken together, it was very clear these weren't random glitches. They looked like deliberate acts of evidence tampering, and it appeared that someone with access had tried to blind the investigation from the very start. This was a devastating setback for detectives. In those first critical weeks, leads were scarce, and even some of the most crucial evidence had literally been wiped away by unknown accomplices. As the months turned into years, Eliza Sherman's case languished without an arrest. Investigators faced repeated dead ends and frustrating missteps that stalled progress. Gregory Moore, who remained a person of interest, continued to practice law for a time, giving an unfortunate double meaning to the term criminal attorney. In 2016, more than 3 years after the event, a grand jury finally indicted Moore, but not for the slaying itself, but for charges related to obstructing the investigation. He had lied to police about his whereabouts and role on the day of the attack, and investigators had uncovered even more unsettling behavior. Moore had a history of making bogus bomb threats to delay court proceedings. In fact, back in 2012, he had phoned in bomb scares to courthouse buildings as a tactic to postpone trials. This revelation painted a picture of a man seemingly terrified of facing courtroom showdowns and willing to commit crimes to avoid them. And hang tight, because this is what we call foreshadowing. By 2017, Moore pleaded guilty to charges of falsification for his lies to detectives and inducing panic for the bomb threats. He served a mere 6 months in jail, but this family attorney was thankfully quickly divorced from his license to practice law. However, with no further charges filed at the time, Moore walked free after his short jail stint, and the specter of Eliza's unsolved case continued to haunt investigators and her family. Behind the scenes, Cleveland detectives kept the file open, but were running out of angles. By 2021, with the 10-year mark approaching and the case still unsolved, the Cleveland police took a pivotal step. They handed the case over to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The idea was to get fresh eyes and cutting-edge forensic technology involved. BCI's cold case unit, under the State Attorney General's office, had resources and analytical tools beyond the scope of the local department. This unit approached the case methodically, re-examining every piece of evidence and applying new technological techniques in DNA and digital forensics. Crucially, they were determined to find something that had been missed in the earlier investigation, and bit by bit, the cold case began to warm up. What local investigators had long suspected, the BCI team set out to prove. Cell phone technology, in particular, provided the long-awaited breakthrough. Every time a phone pings a cell tower or connects to Wi-Fi, it leaves a trace. Investigators discovered that on the day of the attack, Gregory Moore's phone behavior was anything but normal. For a critical 3-hour window around the time of Eliza's death, Moore's cell phone went dark. He had deliberately disconnected it from the network. This was a calculated move to avoid creating any cell tower location records placing him near the crime scene. To seasoned detectives, that kind of silence spoke volumes. It was as if an invisible alarm bell rang. An ordinary person has no reason to power off their phone for the duration of an event such as this, unless they're trying to hide something. It made even less sense for Moore since he was a practicing lawyer at the time, and going dark while working made no sense, even if it was on a Sunday. The BCI team pieced together that right after the time of the stabbing, Moore powered his phone back on. While the initial investigators knew he made efforts to reach her right after, they didn't know that his phone had been off until a few moments after the completion of the deed. Notably, in the days following the slaying, Moore went so far as to obtain a new phone altogether, presumably to distance himself from any records on the old device. Such actions demonstrated an unusual level of planning and consciousness of guilt. Digital evidence wasn't the only puzzle piece that BCI re-examined. They revisited surveillance systems and building access logs with fresh scrutiny. Moore's keycard swipe into his office building was logged later that same evening after Eliza had been slain. This suggested he returned to the scene not long after the crime, possibly to retrieve evidence or verify that evidence had been destroyed by those who helped him out. With all that said, I led off by telling you the motive would be unusual, so let's get to it. Prosecutors now allege that Moore's motive was straightforward and disturbing. He wanted to delay or derail the divorce trial that was set to begin that week. This was a trial he was unprepared for or afraid to face, and as noted, he previously called in bomb threats to avoid trials. This educated professional allegedly concluded that slaying his own client was the solution to his problems. As mentioned, Moore had a documented history of drastic delay tactics, and in Eliza's case, investigators say he went to the most extreme act possible. The plan, according to the prosecutor's allegations, was originally to kidnap Eliza Sherman as a delay tactic to prevent her from appearing in court. Along the way, something went horribly wrong. Prosecutors believe that Moore changed his plans for reasons which are yet unknown. After 12 long years of uncertainty, the hard work of the cold case investigators finally paid off. In early May 2025, a Cuyahoga County grand jury reviewed the mountain of new evidence and returned a secret indictment charging Gregory Moore. Armed with this indictment, law enforcement moved swiftly. On May 24, 2025, the disgraced lawyer was extradited back to Ohio in handcuffs, ready to face the consequences of his alleged deeds. When the news of Moore's arrest broke, it sent shockwaves through Cleveland. At a court hearing in late May 2025, Moore, now 51 years old, pleaded not guilty to all charges. A judge ordered him held on a $2 million bond and demanded a DNA sample, while also forbidding any contact with the Sherman family. For now, Moore awaits trial and remains innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. It was just after midnight on September 2nd, 1995, when Richard Martin was forced out of Nancy's Bar, a local tavern along Highway 81 in Williamston, South Carolina. He had been ejected by bar staff for being too intoxicated. Outside in the parking lot, another patron from that night, a local man named Bobby McLean, was lingering. Inside, witnesses later recalled seeing Richard dance with a woman, which had made McLean jealous. That simple conflict over a dance was about to turn deadly. Around 1 a.m., Richard was found lying unconscious in the middle of Welcome Road, a dark rural route about 3 miles from the bar. He had been savagely beaten, suffering severe head injuries. First responders rushed him to a hospital, but he never regained consciousness and died later that day. Whoever attacked him fled into the night, leaving behind a gravely injured young man and a baffling mystery, which the authorities claim is now solved. And you'll notice my use of the word claimed here, since I see some pretty big issues with this claim. I'm going to break down the official version of the narrative here, and then I'm going to pick apart the evidence that was used to put that narrative together. Detectives arrived at the scene and immediately began to zero in on McLean. The attack on Richard seemed targeted and vicious. The autopsy confirmed he'd been struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object. The weapon was never found, but investigators suspected that it was a heavy club, based on the nature of Richard's injuries. That suspicion pointed to Bobby McLean, who was widely known to carry around a baton and have a violent temper. From the very beginning, McLean was the prime suspect. McLean was questioned soon after the attack. He claimed that after leaving the bar, Richard got into a car with other men, an account that the authorities claim witnesses later disproved. According to the authorities, no evidence ever supported the involvement of any mystery men. McLean's apparent false statements only heightened suspicions that he was covering up his own guilt. Investigators even had McLean take a polygraph test, which he failed. But of course, a lie detector alone isn't nearly enough to make a case, and doesn't really detect lies regardless. Still, in 1995, the sheriff's office believed they lacked the hard evidence to arrest him. It's important to remember that the prosecution only has one chance to take a run at a suspect, and they have to prove the offense beyond a reasonable doubt. In our system, the burden of proof remains entirely on the prosecutors to prove that McLean committed the attack. This left the authorities in a tough position. They knew they almost certainly had their guy, but they just didn't have the evidence they needed. There were no eyewitnesses to the beating and no forensic proof tying McLean directly to the crime. With only circumstantial clues and a suspect who denied everything, the trail grew cold and Richard's case lingered unsolved. In 2017, Anderson County Sheriff Sergeant Scotty Hill took a fresh look at the case. He found the case file cluttered with decades of rumors and misinformation, so he worked to strip away the hearsay and zero in on solid facts. The passage of time posed its own challenges, and many people originally involved had moved away or even died. Hill refocused the investigation on the bar where Richard was last seen, and the man long suspected to be responsible, Bobby McLean. As Hill's team re-examined witness statements and reports, they uncovered crucial evidence that they claim had been overlooked. They claimed, for instance, that McLean's 1995 alibi was fabricated from start to finish. They also claimed that the story about Richard leaving with other men was false, though the authorities didn't indicate that anyone had seen him leave with McLean. Investigators also found witnesses who indicated that McLean was carrying a club with him on the night of the attack. While before he had been known to carry a club, this evidence suggested he was actually carrying a club on the night in question. Investigators revisited the autopsy findings and determined that he had been bludgeoned with a club. Notably, they couldn't arrest McLean since he had died of unknown causes 15 years prior. On May 13, 2025, the sheriff held a press conference to announce the conclusion of the Richard Martin case, where they claimed that McLean was undeniably the perpetrator. Investigators explained that the likely motive for the attack was simple jealousy. A minor barroom dispute based on a dance with a woman McLean desired had exploded into a fatal encounter. Investigators believe McLean ambushed Richard as some sick form of payback, and the rest is history. Personally, I have some serious problems with this conclusion, and I question whether they would have made such an announcement if McLean was alive. Also, I'm about to go off on a bit of a rant here, and I want to know what your thoughts on the evidence against McLean are in the comments below. I'll start at the tip of the iceberg and point out the obvious. No forensic evidence from Richard's body ties McLean to the beating, and investigators still admit the blunt instrument used in the attack was never recovered. Further, detectives lean on the fact that McLean was known to carry such a weapon and was seen with one in his possession. Yet plenty of bar bouncers and other locals owned similar weapons in the 1990s, and we know that Richard was ejected for being too intoxicated. Further, every witness places McLean inside or outside the bar, not on Welcome Road where the beating happened. If the prosecution actually had to prove this case, they would have to build a timeline that moves McLean, undetected, 3 miles away. Notably, the entire theory rests on McLean allegedly growing angry when Richard danced with a woman. No witness recalls an earlier physical altercation between the two men that night. It's not as though the two got into a physical or verbal altercation in the bar and then took it outside. Richard was kicked out for being too intoxicated. McLean maintained he wasn't involved, and the only indication that he wasn't telling the truth was a polygraph test, which doesn't actually test for lies or deception regardless. Further, there's a lot of reliance on the memory of patrons of a bar 30 years ago, which is problematic for a number of reasons. I may shock some of you here, but people tend to be intoxicated in bars, and people who are drinking generally don't have the most accurate memory of events. Add in the passage of 30 years, I suspect these memories could have been influenced by the investigative process itself, which brings me to the next problem. The investigators and witnesses will never have to be subjected to cross-examination by defense counsel, since there will never be a trial. Essentially, this key truth-finding element has been entirely removed from the process, and now we're expected to take 30-year-old eyewitness testimony at face value. Again, these are people who were out and intoxicated, and have also been subjected to 30 years of the rumor mill as well. Further, detectives claim McLean volunteered crime scene facts during the initial investigation that only the perpetrator would know. However, if this was true, then this is essentially an admission that the initial investigation was fumbled. If they had all the circumstantial evidence at the time, and they also had McLean admitting to things only the perp could have known, then he ought to have been arrested in '95. Officers now say McLean's 1995 statement that Richard left with other men was fabricated, but they've never explained how they came to this conclusion. They haven't identified the people who supposedly contradicted the story, nor provided a timeline showing McLean's whereabouts while Richard was assaulted. Because McLean died in 2010, investigators can no longer confront him or explore innocent explanations for inconsistencies. Of course, confirmation bias is a real thing as well. McLean was labeled the prime suspect within hours, partly because he was known to carry a baton and had a temper. Once a theory hardens, detectives often look for cues that confirm it and discount those that don't. Once you strip away all the elements of this so-called solved attack, what you have is speculation about a guy who is no longer around to defend himself. Closing Richard Martin's file may comfort his family, and it may even be correct, but the evidence made public so far can't rule out other attackers. This, of course, means that on the basis of the evidence that's been provided thus far, the real perpetrator could still be out there. Anyway, again, let me know in the comments what you think of the evidence against McLean. Maybe I'm missing something here, but the puzzle pieces just aren't fitting together for me. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, by clicking one of the links or by searching it up wherever you get your podcasts. On June 16, 1978, the day after classes ended for summer break at Branham High School in San Jose, California, the campus was nearly empty as teachers cleaned their classrooms. A student in the hallway heard faint cries for help and rushed toward the sound. They found Diane Peterson, a young teacher, lying on the floor near her classroom with a single stab wound to her chest. The attack had occurred in broad daylight inside a school, a shocking and brazen crime that stunned colleagues, students, and the community. Efforts to save Peterson failed, and she succumbed to her wound, leaving the tight-knit school community in shock and grief. Investigators immediately began searching for the perp. Witnesses reported seeing a young man in the hallway around the time of the attack, and police created a composite sketch based on their accounts. Before long, they focused on a 16-year-old student named Nikki Nickerson. Nickerson, a Branham High student, was quickly brought into custody just 4 days after the slaying, as his appearance strongly resembled the composite drawing. Early clues reinforced the suspicions about Nickerson. One witness told police that Nickerson had been seen carrying a knife engraved with the words "Teacher Dear," and even claimed that he confessed to the stabbing. It was a bizarre and chilling detail, hinting at a possible personal obsession with Diane. However, detectives couldn't find any physical evidence or independent confirmation to back up the witness's story. With no forensic proof and only uncorroborated accounts, authorities had to release Nickerson due to a lack of concrete evidence. Despite the initial promising leads, the case remained unsolved. Nickerson's release meant the investigation had hit a wall, and detectives were left without answers. In the years that followed, the investigation saw a few hopeful moments that ultimately fell apart. In 1983, the family of one Branham student told police their son claimed to have witnessed the attack and identified Nickerson as the culprit. When officers interviewed that student, he recanted his story and denied seeing the crime, dashing that hope. Then in 1984, another witness came forward saying that Nickerson had implicated himself in the slaying and suggested the motive was that Peterson caught him in a substance deal on campus. If true, it meant the slaying may have been a panicked act to silence the teacher after she witnessed his illicit activity. But even this potential motive remained only a theory without corroboration. This allegation hinted at a reason for the attack, but again there was no solid evidence to support it. Each time a lead emerged, it collapsed under scrutiny, and the case grew cold. Detectives also noted that each version of events was very different, suggesting that the rumor mill had simply gone into overdrive. After all, the fact that Nickerson had been held by the cops was public knowledge, so he would of course be the obvious target of such disparate rumors and explanations. For decades, Diane Peterson's case sat among the cold case files with no signs of resolution in sight. In 2011, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office formed a dedicated cold case unit to re-examine unsolved slayings. This team, which ended up successfully resolving numerous other decades-old cases, turned their attention to Peterson's case. Investigators took a fresh look at the evidence using modern techniques. Between 2023 and 2024, they conducted extensive DNA testing on items from the crime scene, hoping to find a genetic clue to the perpetrator's identity. Unfortunately, the DNA analysis didn't turn up any match or new information, and it turned out the breakthrough would come from classic detective work rather than science. In 2025, as cold case investigators re-interviewed people connected to the case, one of Nickerson's relatives revealed a stunning secret. The family member admitted that on the day of the attack back in 1978, a teenage Nickerson had arrived at their home in a distraught state and confessed to it all. Astonishingly, this confession had never been shared with police until that moment, a key piece of the truth hidden for 47 years. Notably, police had held back a significant amount of information in this case, in the event that someone came forward. The relative's detailed account included specifics that only the perpetrator or police would have known, convincing authorities that the story was genuine. Armed with this new testimony, authorities finally had the evidence they needed to close the case. Investigators carefully verified the relative's account against the facts from the original investigation. The story lined up with the known details of the crime, corroborating the long-held suspicions about Nickerson. In June 2025, officials announced that the 1978 case was officially solved. After nearly half a century, they publicly identified Nickerson as the person who had cruelly ended the life of this beloved teacher. By the time this announcement came, Nickerson was no longer alive to face the music, and the cops announced that he had finished himself off in 1993. Interestingly, as the case concluded, more information emerged about the perpetrator's troubled background. Records showed that in the years after 1978, Nickerson continued to commit violent offenses. He was arrested and convicted on charges including armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and kidnapping. In 1984, he was shot while attempting a robbery, though no charges were filed in that incident for reasons which aren't entirely known at this time. At present, it remains unknown whether his attack on Diane was a one-off anomaly or whether he struck again. In the summer of 1984, a grim mystery unfolded behind the walls of a secretive nuclear plant in rural Ohio. 39-year-old Dave Box, a hard-working union pipe fitter and devoted father of 3, vanished during an overnight shift at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center. Days later, investigators made a horrifying discovery inside this secretive Ohio operation. They found bone fragments, a melted pair of glasses, pieces of a walkie-talkie, and a set of keys recovered from deep inside a furnace heated to 1,350 degrees Fahrenheit. The official investigation couldn't conclusively determine how Dave ended up in the furnace, and authorities eventually ruled out foul play for lack of evidence. But to Dave's family, friends, and many others, the notion that he climbed into the blistering uranium processing furnace on his own never rang true. Decades later, questions still linger about whether Dave Box was silenced for what he knew. Born in 1944, Dave grew up in Ohio and eventually married and had 3 children. Though he divorced in 1979, Dave remained close with his ex-wife and kids, staying involved in their lives. By 1981, he'd landed a steady job as a pipe fitter at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, about 20 miles northwest of Cincinnati. This was the area's major employer, yet few locals knew its true nature. With its innocuous-sounding name and a red and white checkered water tower resembling a pet food logo, many assumed Fernald was some kind of feed or fertilizer plant. In reality, Fernald was a top-secret nuclear facility. From the 1950s through the 1980s, this 1,000-acre site processed high-grade uranium for America's atomic arsenal, all under tight government secrecy. Employees were briefed that the work involved low-level radiation and were sworn to silence about plant activities. By all accounts, Dave excelled in his role as a maintenance pipe fitter at Fernald. His job took him throughout the 8 plants on the site. He was to inspect and repair pumps, dust collectors, and other equipment, including safety systems used in uranium processing. He quickly earned the respect of his coworkers for his reliability and conscientiousness. Dave was also known as a stickler for the rules, and he was someone who took safety extremely seriously and looked out for others. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Dave showed every sign of an ordinary man excited about the future. He'd just remodeled his house, paid all his bills for the month, and even bought a brand new lunchbox for work. If Dave had any worries about his job at Fernald, he didn't share them widely, but Fernald in the 1980s wasn't a typical workplace. Unbeknownst to most, the plant was an environmental time bomb. Its uranium operations emitted radioactive contaminants into the air and water, well beyond safe limits. In fact, just a few months after Dave's death, Fernald was rocked by a scandal. A factory mishap in late 1984 released a cloud of radioactive dust over the countryside. Investigators later revealed the plant had been spewing more than 200 tons of radioactive material into the environment over the years. Trust in the facility and its federal overseers evaporated practically overnight. On Sunday, June 17, 1984, Dave prepared for another midnight shift at Fernald. He met up with his carpool partner, fellow maintenance man Harry Easterling, at a local restaurant around 11 p.m., as they often did. The two men rode to work together in Harry's truck. During the drive, Harry noticed nothing unusual in Dave's demeanor. Dave chatted about taking his kids on vacation and mentioned that new lunchbox he'd bought, extremely ordinary small talk between friends. By 11:25 p.m., they arrived at the plant, changed into work clothes, and went through the routine security and decontamination process to start their shift. Shortly after midnight, in the early minutes of Monday, June 18th, Dave and Harry collected their assignments in the maintenance shop. That night, Dave was tasked with checking a pump in Plant 8, while Harry headed to a job in another part of the facility. Before splitting up, Dave opened his toolbox and, as was his habit, removed the padlock from it and set his keys in the lock on the toolbox lid. Those keys, for his car, his locker padlocks, and likely his house, would later become a critical and confounding piece of evidence. Through the pre-dawn hours, only a skeleton crew was at Fernald. At around 4 a.m., a fellow worker passing by noticed something a bit odd. He spotted Dave sitting in a parked pickup truck with his supervisor, Charlie Shoes. The two men appeared to be having an intense conversation. It was a warm, humid night, yet the truck's windows were rolled up, possibly to keep the conversation private. The employee couldn't hear what was being discussed, but it struck him as serious. Not long after, around 4:30 a.m., Harry Easterling and Dave crossed paths for their scheduled meal break. They clocked back in at about 4:46 a.m., after which they headed off to resume separate tasks. That was the last time Harry saw his friend. Sometime just before 5 a.m., Dave Box was seen one more time. The same worker who had witnessed the truck meeting ran into Dave on the grounds and offered to help him with his work if needed. Dave, who was walking in the direction of Plant 4, not Plant 8 where he'd initially been assigned, responded casually that everything was okay. A short while later, at roughly 5:10 a.m., an anomalous event occurred inside Plant 6, the building housing a high-temperature furnace used for uranium processing. Plant 6 wasn't on Dave's work schedule that night, yet it would soon become the focus of dire attention. Instrument records later showed that at about 5:15 a.m., the temperature in the Plant 6 molten salt furnace abruptly dropped about 28 degrees before returning to normal. Such a dip might happen if something foreign, something with a lot of mass at room temperature, was suddenly dumped into the 1,350-degree furnace. Around the same time, a furnace operator noticed an odd, sticky black residue on the furnace lid and caught a whiff of an unusual odor in the area. He even remarked that what he saw on the lip of the furnace looked like a leg, according to later statements. Startled, the operator alerted a supervisor, but the supervisor was oddly unconcerned. He told the worker to ignore it and keep the furnace running. And so, as dawn broke on June 18th, no immediate action was taken, but Dave Box was nowhere to be found. When the overnight shift ended at 7 a.m. on June 18th, the crew gathered for a routine safety meeting in Plant 4, but Dave never showed up. At first, Harry Easterling assumed his friend had gotten tied up working overtime. After the meeting, Harry returned to the maintenance area and noticed Dave's toolbox still sitting where it was left, lid open. Sure enough, the padlock and Dave's keys were still resting on top, a sign Dave hadn't yet packed up to leave. Keep these facts in mind, because they're going to be important in this mystery going forward. Harry made a few calls around the plant, but couldn't find anyone who had seen Dave. Pressed for time because of an appointment, Harry scribbled a note to Dave and left it on the toolbox, saying he'd waited but had to leave and would be back later. Harry then headed out, concerned but hoping there was a simple explanation for his friend's absence. That evening, however, when Harry returned to the usual carpool rendezvous spot, Dave's car was already there and parked as usual for their nightly meetup. It was Dave's turn to drive that night, but something was off. Dave was nowhere to be found, and the car's hood and fenders felt cool to the touch, indicating the vehicle hadn't been driven recently. Dave had clearly left his car there long before and never returned to it. Alarmed, Harry rushed to work and officially reported Dave Box as a missing person. Plant security helped pry open Dave's locker, where they found the clothes Dave had worn the night before, neatly left behind. The company finally began a full search of the premises, but there was still no trace of the missing pipe fitter. Only then, with Dave unaccounted for, did attention turn back to the mysterious incident at Plant 6 that same morning. By the night of Tuesday, June 19th, management informed the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department of a potential crisis. On Wednesday, June 20th, authorities shut down the furnace in Plant 6, suspecting that Dave's disappearance and the furnace's strange behavior were linked. It took 3 days for the molten salt inside the furnace to cool and solidify enough to examine. What investigators found once they opened it confirmed everyone's worst fears. Within the hardened cake of material were unmistakable human remains and personal items. Among them were several small bone fragments, the steel toe from a boot, part of a metal eyeglass frame, pieces of a two-way radio, and an alligator clip from a work ID badge. Also discovered was a set of keys that, incredibly, matched Dave Box's car and padlocks. One key even appeared to be a house key of Dave's, though the damage from the heat was far too severe to ever confirm this. The recovery of Dave's keys from inside the furnace only deepened the mystery. If the temperature drop in the furnace occurred around 5 a.m., that likely marked the moment something, or someone, entered it. But Dave's keys had reportedly been seen after that time. Harry Easterling was adamant that around 7:30 that morning, he personally saw Dave's keys sitting on the toolbox in the maintenance room. The troubling implication was that someone might have retrieved Dave's keys from the toolbox after Harry left and tossed them into the furnace to destroy evidence. It was a chilling thought, one that suggested deliberate foul play. By the end of that week, on June 22, 1984, investigators had to break the devastating news to the Box family. The Fernald facility, once secretive, was now swarming with law enforcement personnel and besieged by questions. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Department launched an investigation with the limited evidence available. Detectives spent nearly a year interviewing workers and combing through facility records. From the start, the case was fraught with complications. Because it was a Department of Energy site involved in classified nuclear work, there was an extremely high degree of secrecy and security clearances to navigate. Investigators were given a 351-page file of documents from the plant, but suspicion lingered that not everyone was fully cooperative. Despite the mysterious circumstances, plant management and some law enforcement officials leaned towards the potential that Dave did it himself. Lacking a clear motive or any evidence of any violence, the sheriff's office eventually concluded there was no concrete evidence that he had been forced into the furnace. The authorities looked heavily into Dave's mental health history during the investigative process, and it was significant. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia years earlier and reportedly suffered occasional hallucinations. Around the time of his divorce in the late 1970s, he experienced a severe mental health emergency. But by 1984, those who knew Dave insist he had turned a corner. He was on regular medication and in counseling, and his ex-wife and children said he was stable and optimistic. Dave hadn't had any breakdowns or mental health crises in the years leading up to his death. He had many future plans, including a summer vacation with his kids, and had taken steps to continue renovations on his home. He had none of the telltale signs of someone preparing to end it all, though of course sometimes people with that sort of ideation deliberately make things appear very normal. The reasoning being, of course, not to set off any alarm bells from loved ones who would obviously intervene. Even Dave's psychiatrist reportedly agreed that Dave seemed to be in a good place in the months leading up to this event. That said, it's unclear when the last time Dave attended with his psychiatrist was, and for someone like Dave, who had no acute ongoing problems, it could be months between appointments. The authorities also investigated the possibility of an accident, but found it highly unlikely. The furnace in Plant 6 was about 4 feet tall, with a heavy lid covering most of its top. The only opening was a narrow hatch roughly 9 by 22 inches across. To end up inside, Dave would have had to climb a ladder and then contort or force his body through that small gap. It would have been difficult for anyone, let alone a stocky man in work boots, to accidentally fall in. It was determined that he would have perished virtually instantly while trying to stuff himself into the furnace. This, of course, left the unnerving possibility that arises when you realize he couldn't have fit himself in there either intentionally on his part or by accident. Many in the investigation suspected Dave was slain, and then his body was stuffed into the furnace to destroy the evidence of the crime. A lot of criminals attempt to use various forms of fire and heat to cover the evidence of their misdeeds to varying degrees of success. Not a lot of perpetrators have access to a superheated furnace that can truly wipe away virtually any element of forensic evidence, though. If Dave's body had been inserted into the furnace, the heat wiped away all evidence. Surprisingly, given the secure nature of the facility and the fact that it was an important site for national security, it appears that this area had no security cameras. While cameras clearly weren't as widespread as today, they had already seen mass adoption in the 1980s, which makes me question why there wasn't footage from a nuclear site. While I have no trouble believing that every inch of the facility wasn't covered, I find it very odd that there were no sightings of him on camera during the relevant time periods. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain Dave Box's fate. The one that Dave's children and many co-workers believe is straightforward. Dave was silenced because he knew too much about Fernald's dirty secrets. In this theory, Dave, the rule-following maintenance man who monitored radioactive dust systems, may have discovered alarming information about Plant 8's operations. Notably, Plant 8 was later identified as a major source of uranium emissions, releasing 4 times more radioactive contaminants than any other building at Fernald. Perhaps Dave had seen data or physically observed unsafe practices that he felt were endangering workers and the public. If he intended to blow the whistle, either to authorities or the press, it could have threatened the plant's secret. It's known that Dave was vocal about safety. He'd even confronted a colleague for slacking off on the job and wasn't afraid to report violations to supervisors. Some speculate he might have approached his boss or others about the pollution issue and met deadly resistance. Suspicion often centers on the last people to see Dave alive. On the top of that list is his supervisor, Charlie Shoes, who some have alleged was involved. Shoes spoke with Dave twice in the early morning hours of June 18th, once in that closed-up truck around 4 a.m., and again for about 10 minutes inside Plant 4 not long after 5. In fact, Shoes himself admitted to talking to Dave right around the very time the furnace temperature dropped in Plant 6. If anyone had the opportunity to ambush Dave and dispose of him quickly, a supervisor with freedom to move around the site may fit that role. However, these are just suspicions, and there's nothing concrete to back these allegations. Another name that arose was Ernie Gibson, a co-worker with whom Dave had clashed. Dave had recently complained to management about Gibson sleeping on the job, which led to Gibson's suspension. In what potentially qualifies as an eerie coincidence, Gibson was suspended on the very shift that Dave died. One witness thought he saw Gibson's motorcycle parked at the plant that night, despite the suspension, raising suspicions that Gibson might have snuck in for revenge. Police did visit Gibson's home and found his motorcycle there, but the vehicle wasn't in working order, and they ruled him out. He wasn't questioned further beyond this once it was found out that his bike was broken down, and some speculate that he wasn't investigated sufficiently. That said, I personally find this theory to be extremely weak. If Gibson entered the facility, it would have presumably been logged in some way, and I suspect that when he was suspended from work, his credentials were temporarily revoked. Further, no one reported seeing Gibson on the site that night, and the entirety of this evidence rests on the fact that someone, quote, thought they saw his motorcycle. It also appears that Gibson was entirely cooperative with the investigation and had absolutely nothing to hide about his dislike for Dave. In the aftermath of Dave Box's death, life in Fernald, Ohio changed forever. Just 5 months later, the government was forced to reveal the plant's actual operations amid the pollution scandal. A flurry of lawsuits and investigations followed, and it turned out this industrial site turned the grounds into a toxic dump. The once bustling feed materials production center ground to a halt and was permanently shut down in 1989. Its mission rendered obsolete, and its reputation irreparably tarnished. The site would later undergo a transformation into one of the nation's largest Superfund sites, eventually becoming the Fernald Nature Preserve. Officially, the case of Dave Box is closed pending new evidence, and remains one of Ohio's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just plugging Lazy Chill True Crime, which is available everywhere you get your podcasts. It includes my true crime-related content from this channel, and my content from my dedicated true crime YouTube channel, as well as bonus content not heard anywhere else. Just search up Lazy Chill True Crime wherever you get your podcasts. Tokyo, July 1949, 4 years into the Allied occupation, The summer sun beat down on a city still scarred by conflict. On the morning of July 5th, a black limousine pulled up outside Nihonbashi's Mitsukoshi department store. Out stepped Sadanori Shimoyama, the president of the Japanese National Railways Corporation, who told his driver to wait as he walked into the store. He was supposedly shopping for a birthday gift for his wife, but he never returned. Just after midnight, his body was found on the railroad tracks on the city's outskirts. Was this the result of a desperate act by a man under unbearable pressure, or the result of a sinister plot by any number of actors looking to consolidate power in the lean years of the occupation? By 1949, Japan was experiencing growing strains under the Allied occupation. The early post-war push for democracy had given way to Cold War anxieties. American authorities under General Douglas MacArthur and Japanese leaders grew fearful of the rising Japanese Communist Party and labor union militancy. Strikes and protests were on the rise, prompting a reverse-course crackdown that curtailed union rights. The Japanese Communist Party's unexpected leap in parliamentary seats that year only heightened these fears. At the same time, the economy was in crisis. That year, the occupation forces prescribed a harsh austerity program to curb inflation. This budget cut public spending and wiped out thousands of jobs, and one of its first targets was Japan's sprawling national railway. On July 4, 1949, Shimoyama, just weeks into his new job as JNR president, announced the dismissal of 30,000 employees virtually overnight. This was a reduction ordered by occupation authorities to both save on costs and also weaken communist influence in the labor force. Shimoyama was deeply distressed by the mass layoffs and had even received anonymous threats from those enraged by the cuts. This was the volatile backdrop against which he set out for work on July 5th. That morning, Shimoyama left home as usual, heading to the office, but he never arrived. Around 9:30 a.m., he asked his chauffeur to stop at Mitsukoshi department store in central Tokyo, then stepped out and disappeared into the crowd. Despite his driver waiting for hours, it was the last confirmed sighting of him. When Shimoyama missed his meeting and couldn't be found by late afternoon, a frantic search began. News of the missing railway chief spread quickly, and the public was stunned that such a powerful figure could vanish in broad daylight. Unconfirmed reports later surfaced of a man resembling him seen wandering the city that day, but none could be verified, and as night fell, the mystery deepened. In the early minutes of July 6th, the worst fears were realized. Around 12:30 a.m., a train driver on the Joban line spotted something on the tracks between Kitasenju and Ayase stations. It was a human body, and investigators soon identified the remains as Shimoyama. Japan woke up to the shocking twist that the missing railway president had been run over by his own train. The authorities launched an intensive investigation, with U.S. occupation officers working alongside Tokyo police. But from the outset, they encountered baffling clues. One medical examiner at the scene initially suggested that Shimoyama might have leaped in front of the train, implying he had committed the act intentionally. Yet the formal autopsy swiftly contradicted that idea. It found that Shimoyama had died before being run over. Notably, very little blood was found around his mangled body, indicating his heart was not beating at the moment of impact. In other words, he may have been slain elsewhere, and his corpse laid on the tracks to be crushed to bits by the next train. That said, there's another potential explanation for this evidence that also potentially makes sense, which I'll get to in a moment. Despite months of effort and scores of detectives on the case, police were unable to crack the mystery. Every lead turned into a dead end, and no witnesses could definitively place Shimoyama with anyone, or explain how he ended up where he did that night. There was no note, either from himself or from abductors, and no obvious suspect. In the politically charged atmosphere, the police kept their findings close to the vest and never officially announced any conclusion. In 1964, 15 years after the fact, the statute of limitations expired with the Shimoyama case still unsolved, and the case was officially shut, without any real sense of closure. Over the ensuing decades, several theories have endured. The first theory suggests that he did it himself. Under this view, Shimoyama broke under the immense pressure and guilt of his job. He'd been tasked by the occupation authorities with putting tens of thousands out of work and faced vilification and threats. It's conceivable that by July 5th he saw no other way out. To this day, many consider this a plausible explanation. However, this doesn't necessarily explain why the autopsy findings indicated that he was already dead while on the tracks. That said, there's no indication that any toxicology test was conducted, and some have speculated that he may have taken a lethal dose of a substance prior to going to the track. Under this theory, Shimoyama, who was a conscientious man, didn't want to burden the train operator with the guilt of being the responsible party. That said, he wanted to send a message loud and clear about why he committed the act. So under this theory, he had to have his body mangled by one of his trains. Of course, this doesn't explain why he didn't leave a note or tell anyone that this was his intention. This point does lead down another rabbit hole as well, since some have speculated that a note was found. The contents of this speculative note are of course completely unknown, but it's been suggested he may have blamed the occupation authorities, or even issued support for trade unionists. Under this theory, this note would have had a destabilizing effect, and it was suppressed for political reasons, which of course brings me to those reasons. Another line of speculation blames communists for the attack. In 1949, suspicions immediately fell on those most enraged by the JNR layoffs. Perhaps, it was argued, vengeful fired workers under the direction of the Japanese Communist Party activists abducted Shimoyama as payback. This idea was eagerly embraced by U.S. occupation officials and Japan's government at the time, who pointed to a communist plot. In fact, the Shimoyama incident became a pretext for cracking down harder on leftist unions and the Communist Party. The climate of the era lent some significant weight to the theory that the communists were behind this action. While the Japanese Communist Party would renounce violence and revolution in 1955, in 1949 they still saw themselves as a revolutionary vanguard group set on overthrowing capitalism directly. Further, given the harsh conditions of the era, as mentioned, they had experienced significant electoral success as well. There were also indications that the Shimoyama incident may have been part of a broader campaign against the railway infrastructure. Within weeks, 2 other mysterious rail disasters, a runaway train at Mitaka and a derailment at Matsukawa, were blamed on alleged communist saboteurs. Although those cases later fell apart for lack of evidence, they reinforced the narrative that extremists were undermining Japan's railways. Notably, others have proposed that those subsequent events were caused by the massive layoffs, which potentially cut crucial personnel. Some others have contended that anti-communist elements, perhaps Japanese ultra-nationalists in an unholy alliance with American occupation forces, orchestrated the incident. According to this theory, the conspirators kidnapped Shimoyama and made it look like communists did it, in order to turn public sentiment against the left. While no direct proof has ever emerged, the idea of an occupation-era cover-up continues to intrigue people. The Shimoyama incident was never solved, but it left a lasting mark on Japan. Observers have since called Shimoyama's death a pivotal moment in the occupation era, one that profoundly altered Japan's political trajectory. In its immediate aftermath, the authorities used the incident to accelerate a purge of communists and their sympathizers from positions of influence. Thousands lost their jobs, including hundreds of railway workers identified as troublemakers. In the end, Shimoyama's unsolved death became known to history as the Shimoyama Incident because of this outsized impact on Japanese history. In fact, the case can be made that it had an outsized impact on world history, since there was a realistic possibility in 1949 of Japan fracturing much like Korea did. Only after this incident, and the subsequent train incidents, was the communist influence in Japan largely quelled.